The fiasco involving philandering porn pervert, Assistant Commissioner of New Zealand Police Zealand McSkimming, has once again shown that the majority of executive office holders hired by the previous Communist Labour government were politically influenced appointments. These individuals are fueled by communist authoritarian ideology and guided by badly miscalibrated moral compasses. McSkimming's offending and manipulation of a young woman, a police staffer half his age, should be a watershed moment for New Zealand's policing and justice system. There's more to the problem than what's come out in the press since McSkimming's downfall. The police have successfully held the position of New Zealand's largest organised criminal group for decades. But there's also a serious issue with the public servants who make decisions on and carry out prosecutions in concert with those same police. The prosecution of McSkimming's victim, as a response to her repeated public appeals for justice, has the fingerprints of Crown Law and the Wellington Crown Solicitor all over it. Crown Law is headed by Solicitor General Una Jagose. They've previously done a report covering issues around Jagose's repeated errors of judgment, questionable ethical standards, and fitness for office. That report's linked in the description below. Jagose is the individual who wanted to dissuade police from prosecuting people who are fractionally related to a treaty subject from 185 years ago. Under the Crown prosecution regulations, Crown prosecutions are limited by default to indictable offences, so generally for less serious offences, an agency prosecution is the default. A Crown prosecution applies to more serious offences, murder, rape and drug dealing and so on. But the Crown can also step in and take over a police prosecution under certain circumstances. Now, the charge against McSkimming's victim was a relatively minor offence under the Harmful Digital Communications Act. It was not an indictable offence and therefore was not a Crown prosecution by default. The charge was laid by the police, but the Crown stepped in and took over the prosecution early on in the proceeding. Now, that's very important because once the Crown steps in, any failings in the police prosecution are inherited by the Crown, and the Crown cannot ignore any dodgy police conduct that it discovers along the way. All the evidence leads to the conclusion that the Crown took over the prosecution from the police under Section 4.1e of the Crown Prosecution Regulations. It's pretty obvious that the Crown would take over the prosecution of McSkimming's victim because of McSkimming's position as the Statutory Assistant Commissioner of Police, New Zealand's number 2 cop in seniority, and the potential public scandal, of course, coming out of the allegations made against him. So that's how a low-level Harmful Digital Communications Act charge ended up being championed by the Crown instead of the police. Now, what we know from the IPCA McSkimmingate report is that Crown Law and the Wellington Crown Solicitor must have had all the same material prosecution evidence and information in front of them as the police did. The prosecution file must have included all the repeated and explicit emails and social media messages in which McSkimming's victim detailed her allegations. Even with these publicly made complaints raising red flags all over the place, the Crown Solicitor persisted with the prosecution regardless. Our outrage that the police chose to prosecute McSkimming's victim should be as much directed at the Wellington Crown Solicitor and the Crown Law Office as the New Zealand Police. In fact, more so. Both Crown Law and Wellington Solicitor Grant Burston knew by mid-2024 that their defendant was Zealand McSkimming's victim, yet they allowed her prosecution under the Harmful Digital Communications Act to drag on for 15 months, only withdrawing the charge in September 2025 after relentless defence advocacy from the Victims' Council and mounting public outrage. Despite Crown Law's own review confirming police had buried the victim's credible allegations of sexual and psychological abuse by Deputy Commissioner McSkimming, and despite Burston's office receiving repeated submissions that prosecuting a traumatised complainant failed the public interest test, both arms of the Crown chose institutional protection over justice and transparency. Crown Law was silently complicit, and the Crown Solicitor was actively persecuting the victim. These actors in the criminal justice system, I argue, need to be held to account for their part in McSkimmingate. A frequent tactic used by the New Zealand Police to silence criticism or dissent is to frame the victims of criminal behaviour at the hands of police officers and other state agency actors. This involves framing their victim as a defendant in a prosecution, often a prosecution in which the victim should rightly be the complainant. The history of this tactic is well documented. Recall, for example, the off-duty police officers who assaulted members of the public in the centre of Christchurch. The victims were charged, but no action taken against the drunken, brawling police officers who acted out that night. Our criminal justice system is littered with the victims of prosecutions championed by the Crown Prosecution Service, which involve dodgy prosecution conduct done in concert with criminal offending by police officers. Alan Hall is a classic example of this kind of joint venture prosecutorial misconduct. Following public disquiet over the mishandling of Hall's case, 2 detectives and a former Crown prosecutor are facing criminal charges of perverting the course of justice for tampering with evidence. Alan Hall spent 19 years in prison, Tiana Pora 21 years in prison, and David Little 4 years in prison. These prosecutions were all tainted by police manufacturing, manipulating, or failing to disclose evidence with either active support or willful blindness from Crown prosecutors. All of the criticisms levelled at the New Zealand Police in the wake of McSkimmingate are richly deserved, and let's not forget that McSkimmingate has overshadowed the very serious issue of 120 police officers falsifying over 30,000 evidential breath tests. But it would be a continuation of routine injustice to see only the New Zealand Police held to account over McSkimmingate. The scandal should also be a watershed moment for the Crown Law Office and the Crown Prosecution Service. Both these entities are the high-powered enablers and facilitators of police misconduct. Remember how Crown Solicitor for Palmerston North, Ben Vanderkolk, avoided prosecution for attempting to pervert the course of justice in the Himara murder investigation, despite a $20,000 costs award being made against him by the High Court. Vanderkolk still retains the Crown Solicitor's warrant in Palmerston North. Now, don't get me wrong, there are no grounds for the New Zealand Police to avoid any of the public vilification that they so richly deserve in the wake of McSkimmingate. But the police are only part of the rotten hole that is the toxic New Zealand criminal justice cesspit, hiding out of sight and out of mind between Marxist judges who defy the law and give back gang patches and corrupt police officers embedded with the New Zealand Police. In between these malevolent actors, there's a shadowy network of morally bankrupt Crown prosecutors who are long overdue for marching to the gallows of public accountability. The government is responding to McSkimmingate by appointing an inspectorate of police, and that's a step in the right direction. But does it go far enough? Should an inspectorate of Crown Legal Services also be appointed? Will Una Jagos be finally appointed to the office of Penultimate Solicitor General, or will she survive this scandal, which once again impugns her competency and ethics? Should Una fall on her sword and resign? What do you think? One thing I'm sure that we can all agree on: we were lucky not to end up with Javon McSkimming as the Commissioner of Police. How scary would that be? A deviant, philandering pervert presiding over New Zealand's largest organised criminal group. And can I just say to Justice Rachel Dunningham and District Court Judge Tom Gilbert, both of whom were unpersuaded that the police are New Zealand's largest organised criminal group, told you so. Those are my views. Leave a comment and let me know yours. Thanks for watching. Give us a like, would ya, and do hit subscribe to be notified of new content as it drops. See you next time.